My name is Amélie Canavale, and I am the director of the CAnD3 program. And today I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Paez to talk to us about unlocking Canadian research, the power of open science. So if we can go to the next slide, please. First, I want to acknowledge that CAnD3 is a partnership that is made of the many contributions of our many partners, 38 and counting, and of course hosted at McGill University, to which we're very grateful, and with the support, the financial support of the SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And speaking of being grateful, next slide, please. Je veux reconnaître également que l'Université McGill est sur un emplacement qui a longtemps servi de lieu de rencontre et d'échange entre les divers peuples autochtones, incluant les nations Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. Et nous reconnaissons toujours à CAnD3 et nous remercions ces peuples dont les pas ont marqué ce territoire et sur lesquels les peuples du monde entier se joignent maintenant. As we do today, as Dr. Paez is not in Canada, and so joining us from abroad, and we're very grateful for that. And CAnD3 really does try to espouse and connect with that spirit of community and engagement and bringing different partners and different perspectives together. So we try to uphold that legacy. Next slide, please. So today we will have, as usual, the speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A. So please write down your questions in the chat box anytime. So this is the box that you see at the bottom of your screen with the little Q&A. I've just activated it, so you can submit questions anytime there, and I will moderate in the Q&A section. We'd love to hear from you, so if you can tell us what your affiliation is, it's always good. So next slide, please. So today's speaker, I'm very pleased that we have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Paez, who is a full professor in the School of Earth, Environment and Society at McMaster University, one of our partners, where he divides his time between teaching and research with a focus on transportation and spatial analysis, timely topics if there ever were ones. You probably heard about our woes in Quebec with some new transportation systems, the REM. His research output includes more than 150 peer-reviewed publications, and he is also co-author of the book Discrete Choice Analysis with R, published in Springer's flagship series, Use R. He is a civil engineer by training, and was adopted into geography and has become an acclaimed social scientist. We love at CAnD3 interdisciplinarity and breaking down the boundaries, and so we're delighted to feature that work. Among his accolades are the 2010 Meredith F. Burrell Award of the Association of American Geographers for policy-oriented research, and most recently, the 2024 Edward Ullman Award of the Association of American Geographers for his lifelong contributions to transportation geography. Antonio has a long-standing interest in open science and societal impacts of transportation, and currently, he is part of the leadership team of the SSHRC-funded project, Mobilizing Justice. So on that, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Antonio. Thank you so much for joining us, and please take it away.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Hopefully the sound is okay, the volume is okay. And let me begin by thanking the consortium for the invitation to talk, have this conversation with you. And I do a lot of data-driven work. So I think that, there is a strong affinity in terms of what you do and the things that I'm interested in. But as I thought about what would be a good topic for this conversation, I thought that talking about open science would be hopefully interesting. As you can see, the idea is to talk about the power of open science to unlock Canadian research. I think that we have a great opportunity at the moment to increase our profile as a country that is a leading power in science, and that we will do well to do that in a way that is faithful to the principles of open science. So the slides will have some interactive components. As you can see at the top, the instructions are there. So it says join at menti.com. It gives you a code. So all that you need is your browser. That can be on your cell phone, your tablet, your computer. Just visit the website, enter the code. It doesn't need any application or any software to be installed. So the instructions will be there. And I would like to begin with a question for you to get a sense of the audience this morning in Canada. Okay, we'll give this a just a moment. I see that there are about 30 people in the call, and we'll see how the responses go. So far, social sciences well represented. So we'll see what's the composition in a moment. Okay, and seeing how the director of the program is in policy and equity, perhaps I'm not surprised that there will be a strong social sciences representation here. And yet there will be some science people and at least one person who is in the arts and humanities. So that's great. So I'll move to the next slide with a quick follow-up question about your level of interest in science. Okay, and we can see that this is a very sciencey audience, including those in the sciences, but also pretty much everyone who is in the social sciences and also in the art and humanities. So I sometimes suspect that there will be a spread between that, but makes sense that it will be a very sciencey audience today. So let me continue with a short story of diabetes. And this is straying from my field of specialization, but I really wanted to highlight something that hopefully you will see is very relevant for us in Canada. And this short story of diabetes begins at the earliest in the year 1500 BC. The image that we see here is the Papyrus Ebers, and this is probably the first description of diabetes in record. And it is described here as a condition that is associated with plentiful urine, something that was observed and that is described in a document that actually cites earlier sources. So something that probably is even older than what we get from this one document. So that association of diabetes with one of its most common symptoms is something that continues to be noted over time. So we see here Aretaus of Cappadocia, who was among the first people that we know of to use the word diabetes for this condition. And the word comes from the Greek siphon, which basically was used to express that water entered and it exited as if it was not, processed in any way. So again, there was that association with plentiful urination that had been observed in Egypt, and that similarly in other sources had been observed in India and in Chinese medicine, making reference to that one symptom that was the most visible of the condition. So things didn't really change a lot. And here we see Paracelsus, who continues to make that note that there was this condition that was associated with plentiful urination, that was the mark of something that was a very serious condition. But it's already at least 3,000 years of the symptoms being recognized and mostly being attributed to a condition of the kidneys or of the bladder. So in every single source that had been that had made that reference to diabetes, it was said that it was a condition that irritated the kidneys, that was associated with urination and the kidneys. So nothing really changed much in millennia in terms of the understanding of what that condition was. It was only in 1788 in a document published by Thomas Colley that the association between diabetes and the pancreas was made. It was probably the first time that connection was made, and it was a hint. This document from 1788 discussed the examination of the body, the autopsy of a patient who had succumbed to diabetes, and it describes the autopsy very carefully, including the presence in the pancreas of some abnormalities. But it was the first time that that connection was made, that, well, maybe the kidneys are just an immediate symptom of something that is subjacent. And as you can see, this is written in English from the 18th century. There is an inquiry into the different theories of the disease, and that connection to the pancreas was something that was later picked up by different researchers until in 1922, that is about 100 years ago, this group of researchers at the University of Toronto, Banting, MacLeod, Best, and Collip, finally made that connection, that the pancreas was not just associated with the disease, but actually was where a solution or a treatment could be found. So this went from being a short, disgusting, and painful condition where people will survive, in some cases, days, at most months, getting diabetes at any time in history until, the 20th century was basically a death sentence. This photograph of Leonard Thompson is the first patient in history to receive insulin as a treatment for diabetes, and where his prospects were of a few days of life. He went on to live more than a decade longer before dying because of pneumonia. So it was not actually diabetes that caused his death. He was the first person to, overcome that limitation or that, prognosis of just a few days to a few months of life. So this went from short, disgusting, and painful lives to something that was potentially a pretty normal life with a life expectation that far, far, far surpassed anything that could be conceived before then. So what changed between Paracelsus and Banting and MacLeod and their collaborators? You will see in the slides there is an opportunity to share some text. So sharing of information. Sharing of information is something that changed in maybe the quantity and the quality. But we see that, Egyptian sources already had papyrus that was used to share information. The Chinese had written sources. The Ayurveda, the Indians also had ways of communicating. Paracelsus certainly did leave quite a bit of writing. There was globalization, maybe, in that there will be different sources that did not necessarily communicate. So, for example, the work of the Cappadocian was not translated into Latin until the 15th century. So it was something that was accessible only in Greek for centuries, right? So of all these answers that are, related, more information from more sources, different ways of thinking about the origins of disease, and so on and so forth. And I think it could be argued that what changed was that science, modern science, was invented at about that time. So why is that important? Not so much because it gives a lot of information, not so much because it makes it easier to share, not so much because it's more global, but rather because it gives us a way of learning. Science is a way of achieving knowledge that is systematic and that follows a certain rules of evidence that often calls for standardization in the form of um, defining units for things that are measured, having standard ways of communicating that, rules of evidence, and so on and so forth, right? So something that didn't really change in millennia, within the span of a few hundred years, went from being misattributed. It was thought that it was caused by humidity and cold. Well, not at all, right? So being misattributed and misdiagnosed as a condition of the kidneys and the bladder, to being correctly associated with the pancreas, and not only the pancreas, but the production of a substance in the pancreas that is insulin, right? So the scientific method is what really helped in making all those discoveries that eventually lead to that one um, uh, uh, hallmark discovery that changes the life for countless people who are afflicted by this. So science um, is a way of learning, and it works almost like magic. Uh, if you didn't know that it's a method, um, you will be surprised about how effective it is. So after trying over centuries and centuries and centuries, different ways, different methods of learning about the world, science is the one that has been by far the most effective. Um, and as was noted in a previous slide, science is actually a collective enterprise, something that going global is good. It means that there will be more people trying more different things, more people learning in more different places with different perspectives, right? And so if we sort of, trace back that maybe just a couple of generations. The origin of the discovery of insulin in Toronto is that Banting was preparing a talk, and he went to bed with a book that he was reading. And that book contained a chapter by Moses Barron, where he notes some earlier experiments in which um, a dog was the pancreas was removed from a dog, and the dog developed symptoms that were exactly like diabetes. So that really inspired him to go and try to figure out what was the connection there. So Banting was inspired by the work of Moses and Barton. He also had colleagues that he could work with. So MacLeod, Banting was not a physiologist, but he could just go visit someone else on campus that was MacLeod, and say, hey, I think that this is an interesting lead. And then MacLeod was a specialist in physiology and endocrinology, so they could collaborate to make this happen. Um, Now, Barbon in turn was inspired by the work of Minkowski and von Mering, who were the ones making experiments with dogs. Um, and if we were to sort of, trace trace the origin of the idea, it just grows in ways that would have been impossible to anticipate. Because Minkowski and von Mering were informed by the work of who knows how many other people who were, practicing science. So there is a network there that connects in many different and potentially unexpected ways to lead to one discovery that is monumental achievement. Um, so science is a collective enterprise, something that benefits from having those connections, and that is practiced by people. Um, so what would you say are the most important attributes of a scientist? The people who engage in the practice of this way of learning that makes them effective and makes the whole enterprise of science effective. Okay, that's great. I love um, I love this answer. So curiosity, yes, I think that a scientist is someone who has that ability to question and to wonder, um, to be curious about, um, related to being inquisitive, being open-minded, um, uh, being um, devoted to continuously learning, being able to, take take new ideas and be challenged by them. So all these are great responses. And transparency, accountability, um, and and being systematic, I think, are really important. Being ethical as something that a scientist benefits from. Being honest, being ethical. So the one that I think stands out for me of those is that, like I said, science is made by humans, and humans are messy. They are people with ambitions. They are people with fears. They experience jealousy and envy and joy and so on and so forth. So science is not something that happens in a vacuum. It's something that humans do, and that, as part of that, is as human as anything, and influenced by everything that goes into being human. Humility is, to me, a key characteristic, perhaps more than being perseverant, um, and or maybe even being curious. Um, but being able to say, I might be wrong, right? It's I'm doing something, and like someone said, all models are wrong, but I'm attached to some of them, especially mine. It's like, if this is something that you're doing, it's inevitable that for most of us there will be an emotional attachment to the things that we do, meaning that I'm really attached to my idea. I'm really attached to what I'm proposing, right? So it's been a lot of work to get there, and yet be able to say I might be wrong. And not just humility, because I might be wrong in secret and hide it, um, but that also having the courage to say, I might be wrong, and yet I'm um, open to the possibility that others will discover my mistakes, right? So being humble and being courageous are two things that I think, in a way, are essential, as much as curiosity, as much as anything else that we can think about the attributes of a scientist. Um, and I don't know if any of you will be familiar with Philip Pullman. Um, Philip Pullman is a writer. He writes fantasy. Um, and I find this quote really interesting, because of all things, a fantasy writer is the one who expresses this in such a concise and powerful way, that it is only through honesty and courage that science can work at all. If science was the work of people who lack the courage, no one will be willing to share anything, for fear of um, being exposed. And that honesty is essential, because someone might be courageous in um, sharing things that are fraudulent or dishonest, right? So that we need those two things for science to work at all. Um, so this is where open science comes into place. And open science, I will argue, is the natural state of science. Um, there will be, histories about how some researchers were jealous and didn't want to share. But mostly science has been so incredibly effective because people have been willing to be honest and um, and be courageous in sharing what they have learned, even if they're proven wrong or partial or right, so that knowledge is incomplete and so on and so forth. So I would argue that open science is the natural state of science, and that requires that openness of scientific knowledge, that it is produced in an open way, that is accessible, that the infrastructure for creating science is also open, that there is also openness in terms of who can participate in the enterprise of science, and open dialogue that ensures that we can have discussions, disagreements, and so on and so forth, but in a way that is open and respectful and intellectually honest. So, like I said, I think that the natural state of science is open, but science has closed itself, which is why we don't just talk about science, but we talk about open science. I mean, somehow the um, the very fact that we talk about open science today is because science has become closed. And two important reasons why I think this has happened is that the cost of entry to become a participant in the enterprise of science has become very, very high. And also that there's been all these perverse incentives that have sort of emerged that have contributed to the closing of science. So in terms of the cost of entry, there are a few things going on into that, including that education, higher education in particular, has changed from a focus on being a cultivated and knowledgeable person, which is sort of the ideal of the liberal arts education in North America, and that has shifted slowly but surely over decades to a focus on employability. What are the skills that you will develop that will add economic value to society? So what that means is that even many of us who have had the privilege of receiving higher education may have been subjected to that, philosophical change that you're not here to learn how to learn. You're not here to learn about being open-minded and critical and so on and so forth. You're here to learn how to push buttons because that's what your job will be. And this is something that has been going on for quite some time. So Walter Kochnik in the 1930s said that whereas the real aim of education was to acquire a philosophy of life, intellectual honesty, and a constant search for the truth, it was already becoming increasingly vocational. It was increasingly that focus on what's going to be your job when you finish here. At the same time, there is also the resources and the time needed for a scientific education. This is something that arguably begins from the early years. In fact, I think that is something that begins for anyone at the prenatal stage of their lives. Whether their mother was well nourished, whether she was free from stress, right? And that all those things will end up having an impact. let alone, everything that happens after that, growing up in poverty maybe, or malnourished, or in a situation that closes opportunities despite potential talent or innate skills. And this brings to mind something that Stephen Jay Gould said, that it's not, no, somehow I'm less interested in the weight and convolutions of the brain of Einstein, that in the near certainty that there were geniuses out there who lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. How much talent, how much genius has gone unfulfilled, that hasn't reached its full potential because of the high cost of entry into the scientific enterprise. But that's not all. It's not only that science is something that some people cannot even dream about. But also, even those of us who do have the fortune of getting the training, getting the skills, being in a position where we can practice science, that there's this increasing combination of perverse incentives that I reduce to some extent here with quality plus money. Quantity plus money is better than quality, right? And those incentives are everywhere. So from, the main vehicle that a lot of scientists will need to even think about a career in science, which is publish books, publish monographs, publish papers, that have become increasingly consolidated in the hands of a few global publishers, to becoming what is essentially an extractive industry, extractive of the work of scientists, for doing the research, for assessing the quality of the research, that it also exploits the funders of science, which are for the most part national governments, and that it's just extracting as much value, an industry that is extracting as much value as it can from the investment and the labor of others. So anyone who is in the field of the sciences will face this, that if they hope to get tenure, if they hope to get a promotion, a salary rise, an award, they have to pass through the publishing industry that will try to extract as much value from them as it can. But this is also aided by institutional incentives. So this is an article about the absurdity of university rankings that will take as an important component how much has been published by faculty in an organization, right? And that those incentives influence how universities and research organizations operate. Using the example of my university, it's Canada is the most research-intensive university. McMaster is the most research-intensive university in Canada, but research-intensive in this context means how many grant dollars do we have? It has nothing to do with how many papers were written, what was the impact of those papers, let alone did they make any difference. It's just how much money did we get in research grants. We're very intensive that way, which obviously filters down, and that ends up, and I don't think it could be otherwise, ends up affecting individual behavior. So this is a plot of number of papers per year with one of McMaster's star researchers, okay? And you can see that this is a famous scientist, um, a, a, an important member of our scientific community at the university, who for years and years and years and years has published 70, 45, 50, 60, 40 papers per year, which if you do the counts in your head, basically means that this star researcher basically is the author or co-author of a paper every 3 days, every 4 days. The weakest years, once a week, right? How is that even possible? How is that even humanly possible? I mean, I can imagine that there are people who have a lot of energy, but one paper a week, when you also have administrative duties and possibly teaching and possibly writing grants and possibly, right? So why does one need to write 70 papers in a year? Well, because that is what, the institution wants. The institution needs to count the papers for the rankings. The institution needs to count the councils will look at the count of papers before they give you money and so on and so forth, right? So you see that the incentive is just right there to do that. Now, this is from that same star researcher, looking at just 1 year of publication and looking at 2021, of almost 50 papers, only one had data that was available for replication and for reproducibility. And data is the lowest of the lowest bars for open science. If you cannot even share your data, then you're basically asking the rest of us to trust you. It's magic, right? With one paper out of 50 on that 1 year that shared data, the research produced by this individual is really not very open. In fact, it's quite closed, to the point that the worst of the responses that I saw of all those papers in terms of data sharing was, it will not be made available, end of conversation, right? Without even explaining the rationale for that. It's just like, we're not doing it. That's it, right? So an extremely prolific star researcher, whose research is basically 95% closed, that is asking us to basically take everything that they say in faith, which is a problem. Not because necessarily we suspect dishonesty, but because science advances even on the things that we did not learn. Science advances even on the mistakes, right? So that's basically closing that possibility for 95 of the research presented by some groups. This is also serious because closed science has other consequences. So closed science puts any practitioner of open science at a disadvantage. It's a lot of work. Practicing open research is a lot of work, which means that the people who do that, they are at a disadvantage compared to people who do not, who can write that additional paper or 5 papers while the person who is doing open research will have to spend all this time producing a piece of work that will be much higher quality. So the consequence of, or another consequence of the way science has closed itself is that it's become no longer that thing that you can trust, but something that scientists who practice closed science are basically magicians, wizards, alchemists, saying, I know the truth, believe me. And again, it's not necessarily dishonesty, but there is no way of proving that they are not dishonest either, right? The one of the most worrisome consequences of this is that closed science leaves science vulnerable when faced with emergence of doubt. These will be, people who will say nothing is true. And closing science just plays into that argument. We cannot believe anything, we cannot believe anyone, and science cannot argue against that when it's basically become alchemy. Open science, I think, with all these issues about the cost of entry, about the perverse incentives, and the consequences of that, has forced me, and I think that is something that I think we all should think about quite seriously, is that science, in its natural state, being open, is a public good. It's something that belongs to all of us, and that increasingly it's become the province of merchants. It's no longer something that we all have access to. It's no longer something that we have the possibility to join. It's something that we can't even question anymore, because the data are not even shared. But it's something that it's in our hands to reclaim. It's something that I think we are in the process of doing so, in the process of making science the public good that it should have been all along. And this includes initiatives that are sort of grassroots, the scientific community, thinking about how do we put this into practice. In terms of education, is teaching each other what is possible, what are the best practices to do open science. Share that as freely as possible. It also includes the education, teaching each other and learning how to do it, but then also putting it in practice with open data products and with transparent and reproducible research. Besides this grassroots effort to reclaim science as a public good, it's also something that is happening at various levels. So OSF, the Open Science Foundation, for example, published recently a guide for social science journal editors. How are editors going to ease their communities into open science, right? It's happening at the level of governments. In Canada, for example, the Tri-Council already has policies that are pointing in the direction of open science. The guidelines, if they're not policy yet, because they are sorting that consultation period, I think, but they basically say that research that you do with public funds should be public. So it's something that is coming from the bottom, but also increasingly also from the top. At the level of governments, and the example here is the European Union also coming to the same realization, and international organizations also recommending open science as the future of science. So to the question of what can Canadian researchers do as we face this potential crisis with a closed model of science that is detrimental to the future of science. And I would say that it is important to demand open science. And that includes, for instance, not citing papers that are not reproducible, not yielding to the claims of alchemy and magic. To prepare for open science, to learn the skills, the methods, the tools that are the province of open science, and then to go on and practice open science. I think that this is mostly a generational challenge or a generational transition that will happen with many of you who are now young researchers, maybe doing your master's or your PhD, and that it's not only important to demand it, but also get ready for it, because it will be increasingly one of the demands of being involved in science. So I'll finish, hopefully not too late, with a quote from Frederick Banting, one of the discoverers of insulin, who say that research is the art of turning money into knowledge. And I love this quote because I think it's, in a way, very truthful, but also sounds a little bit quaint, in the sense that I think what we have achieved in the last few decades of science slowly closing in itself is making research the art of turning knowledge into money. So our task as social scientists, as people interested in science, is to go back from that to taking the money, making it knowledge again. So I will finish here and yield the floor back to our hosts for moderation. Happy to take any questions, comments, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And please, folks, join me in thanking Dr. Baez for this talk. I think there is both hope and sobering questions there. So I don't have Q&A. I don't have questions in the Q&A that have been dropped. There's been a conversation happening in the chat. Dr. Baez, I don't know if you kept up with that. I guess starting with your first question, I think you got a little bit of an under response, because a lot of us are, including myself, are in the health sciences. And so it was like,
okay.
oh, well, are we a STEM? Like, to me, I read science and I think STEM, and health sciences is kind of in between. So you might want to add that category. But again, that is also a question of, do we need those categories? Where does it,
Yes.
are they still useful as, or what do we learn from them? As one of the participants noted, the importance, brought up Kuhn. I'm sure you're familiar with him. It brings me back to my undergrad, and the paradigm shifts in science, and how new folks and students here, that we have a lot of actually bring change, because they're not already kind of set in their ways, in their disciplinary ways. And definitely at CAnD3, we are population researchers. And so that spans a big range of disciplines, from political science all the way to epidemiology. So folks, with that, I've babbled enough. And so please raise your electronic hand if you have a question, or drop it in the chat. I don't think, I'm just going back, and I don't think there was a specific question, but rather a couple of comments. So I don't know if you want to pick up on some of them, Antonio, or if folks have a question now, please raise your hand.
I'm reading some of the comments and
Yes.
they're quite
Well, I
interesting.
had one actually. I was wondering where you see, with the publication industry business model right now,
Mhm,
how do we navigate that? It is so incredibly expensive, right? I'm thinking of your colleague and their I don't know, 50 to 70 papers per year. And at a lowball estimate, that is like $2,000 to $3,000 per paper
mhm.
Canadian, now $5,000 Canadian, to publish that open access.
Mhm.
So that is not a sustainable enterprise, is it?
No, and it fits into that kind of a Red Queen race that you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in place, right? So yes, you're
Mhm.
absolutely right. If all those 70 or 50 papers were published at that cost, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars from one person, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so there is something happening with the publishing industry that I think that it was a mistake for whoever was responsible of regulation to let a lot of the mergers that happened in the past 20 years. Consolidation with big publishers buying smaller ones until you have five big publishers. So I think that that was a mistake, but that's where we are at the moment. But the thing is that uh, once that you have a corporation and it acts like a slow AI, like a slow artificial intelligence, trying to optimize a single objective, which is profits, that the corporation itself finds it extremely difficult to change how they do things, right? And so one of the slides, the one from the European Union, I think, I found that quite encouraging because it talks about establishing a common European Union level publisher for science. I mean, when you think $250,000 maybe from a single researcher to publish, open science or open access, how much is that costing the Tri-Council in Canada? How much is that costing NIH or NSF in the United States? How much is that costing the European Research Council, right? Isn't it less expensive to just fund the infrastructure for publishing
Mhm.
um, in a way that removes those financial incentives, right? So I think that that's quite encouraging, but that it's a wicked problem because it's the cost of coordination, right? So it's not enough for me or for you to say I refuse to publish with Elsevier anymore. Well, I mean, we're basically out of the game, right?
Yes.
So it's something that needs coordination, and that coordination, I think, should be at the level of possibly national governments making those choices.
Also, I sat for 6 years on the board of CIHR, and definitely this has been a conversation because when I say two to three thousand dollars, right? This is just like this is a low ball estimate. Science and nature impose much higher fees, even
Yes.
even than that. So Gabriela Lopez, hi Gabriela, is saying from what I understand, even closed access publications can be shared freely by the authors after a certain amount of time has passed since publication. That is accurate, and that is speaking to the regulation. So in fact, it is accurate to the extent that the requirement is on certain funding mechanisms or agreements
Mhm.
that were passed between the funding agencies and those publishers, and saying past 12 months, I think, is the requirement. So if you
Mhm.
cannot pay for it yourself, the publisher will make it available. But if you would like to make it immediately available, then it's not possible. And I've been in this business, and you probably have been as well, in long enough to see a few phases also of regulation. So we've had, the CIHR at some point of highly recommending setting up data verses and trying to help us do this. We have Ogochukwu that has a question. I think we're gonna keep that one for the special session, because we are unfortunately already at time. This conversation has been so rich. And so we do need to let some of our folks go, but Ogochukwu is part of our CAnD3 Fellows, and the CAnD3 Fellows have an opportunity to speak with you for another 30 minutes. I did want to point out that Quebec has, and the CFI has supported a platform. I don't know if you're aware of that, but there is a platform in French for open access publishing that has been supported institutionally, and that is kind of setting the stage for maybe a different way of doing things. So maybe that's something to feature. I'll share the linkages. But on that, folks, again, a big thank you to Dr. Paez for this talk, bringing us to think about the wider implications of what we do, how we do it, how we share it. This is really at the core of what we try to do at CAnD3. And so if you enjoyed this talk, please join us again next month on April 9th for an exciting Lunch and Learn presentation by Professor Claire Boone, who is just recently appointed at the Department of Economics, jointly with the Department of Equity, Ethics, and Policy at McGill University, and will share with us some of her latest research. If you want to not miss anything that we have to offer at CAnD3, please sign up for our newsletter here and follow us on the various platforms. So thank you again, Dr. Paez. Thank you, folks, for joining us during your lunch hour. Big round of applause virtually and physically from me. And on that, we will bid you goodbye, folks who are joining us from the general public.